Now you need to understand that the layout is very simple. In order to get from the hall of judgment to the place of the execution, you had to walk about a mile. So the Bible tells us that Jesus was asked to carry his cross. There are many different ideas when it comes to this, but history tells us that when they talk about Jesus carrying his cross, he only had to carry, and I'm not minimizing this, please don't say I'm trying to minimize this. He only had to carry the cross beam because it was their tradition to have them tied to this cross beam and carry that the mile. Some historians tell us that no, in this case he carried the entire cross. It doesn't make a difference. Either way, after being beaten and whipped and punched and spit upon, to make Jesus carry this cross was a cruel, cruel torture. The Bible tells us that they had to draft a man by the name of Simon. Simon of Cyrene. History would tell us that he was a black man, as Cyrene was on the coast of Africa, and he was there to celebrate the Passover. And as he was standing by the side of the road to try to figure out what was happening, he saw this innocent man beaten to a pulp, barely recognizable, carrying the cross. And one of the soldiers grabbed Simon and said, "Carry the cross." And Simon carried the cross the rest of the way. They get to the place of the crucifixion. The place called Golgotha. That is the Hebrew word for skull or cranium, as they believed that that place was shaped like a human skull. The word Calvary is the Latin equivalent of that word. And they bring Jesus to this place. And verse 18 in John's Gospel simply says, where they crucified him. Please understand that that is not a simple verse to just gloss over. You see, crucifixion was the most painful, agonizing death that a person could suffer. History tells us that they would take the hands of the person being crucified and take these metal spikes about 6 to 8 inches long and drive them through the bone in the wrist in cold blood. It was such a painful thing that before they would go to crucify them, they would offer them wine mixed with gall, which was like an anesthesia to help numb the pain that they were about to exercise. The Bible is clear that Jesus would not have anything to do with that. And they nailed our Savior to the cross. And then they would attach the cross beam to the vertical beam. And they would take the feet. And though there was a platform for them to stand on, they would take their feet, one on top of the other, and drive a similar stake through the feet. You see, the crucifixion was supposed to last numerous days. It was a very slow and painful process, and it was strategically placed just at the entrance of the city. So as people would come and go over the next few days, they would watch this person who had committed a heinous crime suffer and die. And once that person was dead, the vultures would begin to circle and begin to pick on the flesh of those that were on the cross. This verse 18, it says, where they crucified him. It's not something you should just gloss over. After they would nail him to the cross, the soldiers would lift the cross up and jar it into place, and his whole body would shake in pain. The Bible says that they crucified 2 others with him. History would reflect that these 2 others were probably cohorts of a man named Barabbas. Barabbas, who the Jews disliked, but they would rather have Jesus crucified than let him go. Verse 19 gives us an interesting reality here. You see, when a person was crucified, because it took such a long time, they would hang above their head the crime that they committed. They would nail above the person being crucified whatever crime would be committed, so that anybody who didn't know what was going on and walk by and see the crosses there, they would be able to read what the charges were against this person, what he was found or she was found guilty of. And they would understand. Murdered 6. Execute, whatever they did would be written above their heads. Pilate, in order to anger the Jews, writes above the head on the plaque of the cross that Jesus was on, he writes these words: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. You know, it's ironic that though he meant this as ridicule towards the Jews, how is it possible that a king, stripped naked, beaten, and executed in public, could be a king? Most would say he had lost his kingdom. But for Jesus, he was just entering into it. The Jews were not happy about this. They were quite annoyed. They wanted it to say, he said he was king of the Jews. That was his crime. Pilate says, I have written what I have written. Not only did he write it, he writes it in 3 languages. He writes it in Hebrew. He writes it in Greek. He writes it in Latin, because he wanted everybody to see, of all languages, of all origins, wherever they came from, that this was who he believed he was. In those days, the Hebrew language represented religion. It was the language of Aramaic. The Greek language represented education and philosophy. The Latin language represented the law. And Pilate, though he didn't know it, Pilate, though he didn't understand it, was announcing this very thing, that Jesus died for all. Now, oftentimes, I wonder what would it have been like to be there.